When a racist woman spat at a black cop, she thought she could walk away unchallenged. But what happened next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning that left everyone speechless. It was a sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where kids played basketball in driveways and neighbors exchanged casual nods over their lawns. Officer David Carter, a respected black cop with 15 years of service, was parked on the curb, finishing up his daily report on his patrol laptop. David was known for being calm, approachable, and a pillar of the community, someone who always stopped to chat with local kids or helped elderly residents carry groceries to their door. But peace doesn't last long in a world where ignorance festers. Across the street, a woman was walking her golden retriever. Her posture was stiff, her face scrunched in visible annoyance as she glanced repeatedly at David's patrol car. She quickened her pace, muttering under her breath, clutching her dog's leash as if it were a lifeline. David noticed but thought nothing of it. People often behaved oddly around police cars. He returned his attention to his report. Moments later, the woman, later identified as Lisa Roberts, stormed across the street. Her face was flushed, and her movements jerky, her dog trailing reluctantly behind her. "Hey!" she barked, her voice cutting through the calm air. David looked up, his expression neutral but curious. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked politely, stepping out of his car to greet her. "What are you even doing here?" Lisa snapped, waving an accusatory finger. "This is a nice neighborhood. We don't need your kind hanging around." David's breath hitched, though his face remained composed. He was used to subtle prejudices, averted eyes, unspoken discomfort. But this was different. It was direct, loud, and entirely unwarranted. "I'm patrolling the area, ma'am," he replied, keeping his tone professional. "Just making sure everyone's safe." "Safe?" Lisa scoffed, her voice dripping with venom. "We don't feel safe with you here. Why don't you take your car and leave?" David tilted his head slightly, trying to gauge the situation. "Ma'am, is there a specific issue you'd like to report?" "My job is to address community concerns." Lisa's face twisted into a sneer. "Yeah. My concern is you standing around like you belong here. I don't know how you even got hired." A few neighbors peered out from behind their curtains, drawn by the commotion. Some exchanged uncomfortable looks, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. David, ever the professional, maintained his composure. "I understand your concern, but I'm here to protect and serve. If there's nothing else, I'll get back to my work." But Lisa wasn't done. She stepped closer, her voice growing louder. "Oh, I'm sure you will. Just standing there, pretending like you're better than us. You probably got this job because of some diversity hire nonsense." Before David could respond, it happened. Lisa spat at him, the glob landing on his chest, staining the crisp blue of his uniform. The air seemed to freeze. For a moment, even the birds stopped chirping. David's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a deep, bone-weary hurt. He could feel the weight of every injustice he'd ever faced bearing down on him at that moment. Around him, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Lisa, on the other hand, smirked triumphantly, as though she had proven some unspoken point. Her dog whined softly, tugging at the leash as if it wanted to escape the tension. David slowly raised his hand, wiping the spit away with a handkerchief he always carried. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a quiet strength, a resilience forged from years of enduring what no one should have to. "You have a good day, ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Lisa looked taken aback. She had expected him to yell, to lose his temper, to react in a way that would justify her hatred. Instead, he met her venom with dignity. As David stepped back into his patrol car, the neighbors who had been watching from their windows began to stir. Some shook their heads in disgust at Lisa, while others whispered among themselves, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Inside the car, David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He stared straight ahead, his mind replaying the incident over and over. He had dealt with racism before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him, it was about everything he represented. And as he sat there, trying to steady his breath, he made a decision. This wasn't something he could just brush off. Not this time. Not here. Little did Lisa know, her actions had set off a chain of events that would lead to a reckoning she never saw coming. David sat in his patrol car for a few minutes, steadying his breath, letting the tension in his chest slowly ease. But the pit in his stomach remained. As a seasoned officer, he had been trained to deal with conflict and remain composed under pressure. But this wasn't just about the uniform. This was personal. He looked in the rearview mirror, catching his reflection. The small stain from Lisa's spit still lingered on his chest. David pulled out his phone, opened his voice recorder, and began documenting the incident, detailing every word Lisa had said, every movement she had made. "This isn't just about me," he muttered to himself. "It's about everyone who's ever felt like this." The street had returned to its usual calm, but a few neighbors lingered, pretending to busy themselves with their gardens or mailboxes. David noticed one elderly woman, Mrs. Garcia, standing near her porch, her face etched with concern. As he started his engine to leave, she approached cautiously, motioning for him to roll down his window. "Officer Carter," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I'm so sorry for what just happened. That woman, Lisa, she doesn't represent all of us. Please know that." David gave her a small smile, appreciating the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. That means a lot." She hesitated, looking over her shoulder toward Lisa's house. "She's always been difficult. But this? I've never seen her act like that before." David nodded, unsure of what to say. He had heard these words before, the same apologies from well-meaning people trying to distance themselves from the ugliness of others. And while he appreciated her sincerity, it didn't make the knot in his chest loosen. As he drove away, David couldn't shake the incident from his mind. The look on Lisa's face, the smugness, the hate. It was burned into his memory. He knew he needed to report it, not just for his own sake, but to ensure there was accountability. No one should think they could act like that without consequence. Back at the precinct, David walked in, his uniform still stained, his expression solemn. His partner, Officer Jake Thompson, noticed immediately. "Hey Carter, you okay?" "What happened?" Jake asked, his brow furrowing with concern. David sighed, setting his hat down on his desk. "Had an incident on patrol. A woman came up to me, started yelling, and then she spat on me." Jake's eyes widened. "She what? Are you kidding me?" David shook his head. "Wish I was. I've dealt with this kind of thing before, but this was different. She wasn't just mad about something random. This was pure hate." Jake leaned against David's desk, crossing his arms. "You reported it, right?" "I'm about to," David replied, pulling out his phone. "I recorded the details right after it happened. I just need to file the paperwork." As David typed up his report, a familiar weight settled on his shoulders. The weight of knowing that even with all his professionalism, all his training, and all his good intentions, there would always be people who saw only the color of his skin. Later that evening, David sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched plate of dinner in front of him. His wife, Jessica, walked in, her face immediately registering concern when she saw him. "David, what's wrong?" she asked, sitting down beside him. He hesitated, debating whether to tell her. Jessica had always been his biggest supporter, but he hated burdening her with the uglier parts of his job. "A woman on my patrol today," he began, his voice quiet. "She spat on me." Jessica's face twisted in disbelief. What? David, I don't even know what to say." "I reported it," he assured her, reaching for her hand. "But it's not the first time I've dealt with something like this. And it won't be the last." Jessica squeezed his hand tightly. "No, but it's wrong. People need to know this is happening." The next day, word of the incident had already spread. A neighbor, who had filmed the confrontation from their window, posted the video online with the caption, "Racist woman spits on black cop. Disgraceful behavior in our neighborhood." By lunchtime, the video had gone viral. Thousands of comments flooded in, ranging from outrage to support for David. "This is disgusting. How can people still act like this in 2025? That officer handled himself with such grace. I don't know if I could have done the same. That woman needs to face consequences. Racism like this can't be ignored. David hadn't even seen the video until a younger officer showed it to him at the station. Looks like you've gone viral, Carter, the officer said, handing over his phone. And not in a bad way. David watched the video in silence, his jaw tightening as Lisa's hateful words echoed back at him. He felt a mix of emotions, anger, humiliation, but also a sense of vindication. The world was seeing what he dealt with, what so many others dealt with every day. But this was just the beginning. David knew he couldn't control how people would react, but he could control what he did next. And he was determined to make sure Lisa Roberts understood the weight of her actions. By the next morning, the video had reached national news outlets. Anchors on TV debated the incident. Commentators dissected every word and gesture, and the story spread across social media like wildfire. David's name was now known far beyond his precinct, and with it came waves of support and inevitable scrutiny. Lisa Roberts woke up to dozens of missed calls and texts. She was startled when her husband stormed into the kitchen, holding his phone with a furious expression. "What the hell did you do yesterday?" he demanded, shoving the screen in her face. Lisa's heart sank as she watched the video of herself yelling at Officer Carter, her words laced with venom and hate. Her face, twisted with rage, was unmistakable, as was the moment she spat at him. She had been caught, and there was no denying it. This is taken out of context," Lisa stammered, her voice rising defensively. "He was just standing there and—" Her husband cut her off. "You spat at a cop, Lisa. A cop. And now everyone knows. Do you realize how this makes us look? The kids at school are already texting Jake about it." Lisa sat down, her face pale. The realization of what she'd done and the consequences she was about to face began to hit her. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the very real possibility of legal trouble. Moments later, the doorbell rang. 2 uniformed officers stood outside. One of them, a stern-looking woman, stepped forward. "Mrs. Roberts, we need to have a word." At the station, David's phone didn't stop buzzing. Calls from reporters, community leaders, and even strangers flooded in, all asking for his perspective. For a man who valued his privacy, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. "David, you have to say something," Jessica urged over breakfast. "People are looking to you now. They need to hear your side of the story." David nodded, though he still felt uneasy about the attention. "I'll do it, but I don't want this to be about me. This is bigger than one incident." Later that afternoon, David stood in front of a podium at the local community center. Reporters and cameras filled the room, and a crowd of supporters gathered outside holding signs with messages like, "Stand with Officer Carter," and "No place for hate." David cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium tightly. "What happened to me yesterday wasn't just about me," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "It was about a mindset that too many people still hold, where someone's skin color makes them less deserving of respect, dignity, or humanity." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But let me be clear. Hate doesn't win. It doesn't win because of the good people in this community who refuse to let it take root. I've received messages from people all over the country, black, white, every background, who stand against what happened. And to those people, I say thank you." David's voice grew stronger as he continued. "As an officer, I swore to protect and serve every person in my community, no matter who they are or where they come from, and I will keep that promise. But it's not just my responsibility. It's all of ours. We need to stand up when we see hate. We need to call it out, challenge it, and replace it with understanding." The room erupted into applause as David stepped back from the podium, his message resonating far beyond the walls of the community center. Meanwhile, Lisa Roberts found herself on the other side of the law. Charged with disorderly conduct and assault, she was escorted to the police station, a bitter irony not lost on anyone who had seen the viral video. The story dominated the news cycle. Some praised her arrest as a step toward accountability, while others questioned whether it was enough. Finally, someone faces real consequences for this kind of behavior. Good. Let her sit in jail and think about her actions. It's about time we stop sweeping racism under the rug. But there were dissenting voices as well. What happened to freedom of speech? People are overreacting. This is cancel culture at its worst. Lisa, sitting in a holding cell, didn't feel like a victim of cancel culture. She felt cornered, humiliated, and, for the first time, forced to confront the ugliness of her actions. The world she had known, comfortable, privileged, and largely unchallenged, was crumbling around her. The incident also forced the neighborhood to reckon with itself. For years, people had turned a blind eye to Lisa's behavior. Her sharp comments, her cold demeanor, the way she treated certain people. It was easier to ignore than to confront. Mrs. Garcia, the elderly neighbor who had spoken to David, decided enough was enough. She organized a block meeting, inviting the entire community to discuss what had happened and how they could move forward. "We can't pretend this didn't happen," Mrs. Garcia said, her voice firm. "This is our neighborhood, and it's up to us to make sure it's a place where everyone feels welcome." The meeting was tense at first, with some neighbors defensive and others openly apologetic. But by the end, there was a sense of shared responsibility and a commitment to do better. They agreed to organize events that brought people together, to check in on one another more often, and to confront prejudice whenever it appeared. That evening, David returned home to find Jessica waiting for him with a warm smile. "You did good today," she said, wrapping her arms around him. David sighed, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "There's still so much work to do." Jessica nodded. "I know, but you've started something important." David sat down, reflecting on how one hateful act had ignited a movement. He didn't ask for the attention, but now that it was here, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about justice for him. It was about creating a future where no one else had to endure what he did. The days following Lisa's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, public outrage, and personal fallout. News crews camped outside her house, neighbors avoided her, and even her friends distanced themselves. For the first time in her life, Lisa felt truly isolated. Sitting in her lawyer's office, Lisa stared at a stack of papers detailing the charges against her. Disorderly conduct and assault were serious, but the real weight wasn't legal. It was moral. Her lawyer, a no-nonsense man in his 50s, set his glasses down and folded his hands. "Lisa, I'll be blunt. You've put yourself in a bad position," he said. "This isn't just about the charges. Your actions have sparked a national conversation and the public's not on your side." Lisa's face reddened. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was angry, okay? He was just standing there, acting like he owned the place." Her lawyer leaned forward, his tone sharp. "That's exactly the problem, Lisa. Do you hear yourself? You attacked a man, a police officer doing his job, and you did it because of your own prejudice. Whether you admit it or not, that's what people see." Lisa shrank back in her chair, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't realize." "Well, you'd better start realizing," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "If you want any chance of moving forward, you need to own what you did and show people you're willing to change." The word hung in the air. Change. Lisa had never thought of herself as racist, but the mirror society now held up to her was impossible to ignore. For the first time, she started to question the beliefs and assumptions she had carried for years. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to transform in the wake of the incident. Mrs. Garcia's block meetings turned into regular gatherings, where neighbors openly discussed prejudice, inclusion, and how they could create a better environment for everyone. They invited speakers from local organizations to lead workshops, and even David was asked to share his experiences. At one meeting, a young mother stood up, her voice trembling. "I used to tell my kids to avoid police officers," she admitted. "Not because of anything they did, but because I was afraid of what might happen. Officer Carter, You've shown me that there are good people in the force. I want to do better, for my kids and for myself." David smiled warmly. "Thank you for sharing that. It means a lot. Change starts with conversations like these, where we listen to each other and work together." The meetings became a source of healing for many, a way to confront the unspoken biases that had lingered for too long. Under mounting pressure, Lisa's lawyer advised her to make a public statement. Though reluctant at first, Lisa knew it was the only way to salvage what was left of her reputation. With cameras rolling, she stood at a podium, visibly nervous. Her voice quivered as she began. "I want to start by apologizing to Officer Carter, to my neighbors, and to everyone who saw that video. My actions were hateful and unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for what I did." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I've spent the past few days reflecting on who I've been and the beliefs I've held. It's not easy to admit, but I realize now that I've been part of the problem. I allowed fear and ignorance to guide my actions, and I hurt someone who was only doing his job." Tears streamed down her face as she continued. "I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I'm committed to learning and changing. I want to do better, not just for myself, but for my family and my community." David, watching the broadcast from home, felt a mix of emotions. He wasn't sure if her words were genuine or a desperate attempt to save face, but he hoped for the latter. Change, after all, had to start somewhere. A week later, Lisa was in her garden, pulling weeds, when she heard a car pull into her driveway. Looking up, she froze. It was David, stepping out of his patrol car with a calm but unreadable expression. Her stomach churned as he approached. "Officer Carter," she began, her voice shaky. I wasn't expecting you." David stood a few feet away, his gaze steady. "I came because I wanted to hear from you directly. I saw your apology on TV. I wanted to know if you meant it." Lisa looked down at her hands, dirty from the soil. "I did," she said quietly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I know I can't undo what I did. But I want to change. I want to understand how I became that person, and how to be better." David nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Change isn't easy, but it's possible. It starts with listening and learning, even when it's uncomfortable." Lisa wiped her hands on her jeans, her voice trembling. Do you think I'll ever be able to fix this?" David's reply was measured but kind. "It's not about fixing. It's about growing. And that's something only time and actions can prove." As he turned to leave, Lisa called after him, "Thank you for giving me a chance to say that." David nodded. "We all deserve a chance to grow." Over the next few weeks, Lisa began attending the community meetings and volunteering at local organizations focused on racial equity. Her presence was met with skepticism at first, but she remained committed, determined to show through her actions that she was serious about changing. David, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. The incident had sparked difficult but necessary conversations within his precinct and the broader community. He saw neighbors coming together, supporting one another, and confronting biases they had ignored for too long. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, David stood on his porch, watching children play in the street. Jessica joined him, handing him a cup of tea. "You've made a difference, you know," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. David smiled. "We all have. This isn't just my story, it's everyone's. And there's still more work to do." As the stars began to twinkle above, the neighborhood felt different, warmer, more connected, and full of hope for a future where respect and understanding could thrive. Months passed, and the neighborhood continued to heal from the wounds left by the incident. What had started as a moment of ugliness had blossomed into a movement of understanding, change, and unity. Lisa Roberts had become a familiar face at the community meetings, though her presence still drew mixed reactions. Some neighbors admired her for taking accountability, while others remained skeptical, their trust fractured by her past behavior. Lisa didn't let the skepticism deter her. She attended workshops on racial bias, volunteered at local shelters, and even started helping with neighborhood events. During one block party, she approached Mrs. Garcia, holding a tray of freshly baked cookies. "I know I can't change the past," Lisa said, her voice tinged with humility, "but I hope I can show you I'm trying to be better." Mrs. Garcia hesitated, then took a cookie and smiled faintly. "Actions speak louder than words, Lisa. Keep showing up." Though it was a long road, Lisa's consistent efforts began to chip away at the barriers she had built. One day she found herself standing beside David at a community cleanup event. They worked in silence for a while, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Finally, Lisa spoke. "Officer Carter, David, I just want to say again how sorry I am." David paused, then turned to her. "I know, and I appreciate you doing the work. Keep at it." For the first time, Lisa felt a sense of cautious hope that redemption might be within reach. David's life had also changed in profound ways. His calm and composed handling of the incident had earned him widespread respect, not just in his precinct, but across the country. He was invited to speak at conferences on community policing, sharing his experience, and advocating for deeper connections between law enforcement and the communities they served. "Empathy is the key," David said during one speech. "When we take the time to understand each other, we build trust. And with trust, we can achieve anything." Within the precinct, David spearheaded a new initiative to address racial bias and improve officer training. Younger recruits looked up to him, and even seasoned officers began to approach their work with a renewed sense of purpose. The neighborhood itself became a beacon of hope and progress. The regular block meetings evolved into larger events, drawing people from nearby communities who wanted to learn how to foster inclusivity and understanding in their own areas. One evening, the community hosted a candlelight vigil to honor those who had been affected by racism and injustice. David stood at the front, holding a candle as he addressed the crowd. "We're not perfect," he said, his voice steady. "But we've shown that it's possible to grow, to face the hard truths, and to come out stronger on the other side. This isn't the end of our journey. It's just the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, the glow of their candles lighting up the night. As time went on, the neighborhood story became an inspiration to others. Journalists wrote about their transformation, and community leaders from other cities reached out to learn how they could replicate the changes. Lisa continued her journey of self-reflection, becoming a vocal advocate for equity and justice. She often partnered with David for events, their unlikely alliance a testament to the power of accountability and forgiveness. David, now promoted to lieutenant, carried the lessons of the incident with him every day. He knew the work was far from over, but he also knew that progress was possible. One conversation, one act of kindness, and one moment of courage at a time. One quiet evening, David sat on his porch with Jessica, watching the sun set over the transformed neighborhood. Children played in the street, laughter ringing out as families waved to one another from their yards. "You've changed this place," Jessica said, breaking the comfortable silence. David shook his head. "We've changed it. Everyone who stepped up, who listened, who worked to make this better, they're the real heroes." Jessica smiled. "You're too humble." David took a deep breath, his heart full as he watched the scene before him. The neighborhood was far from perfect, but it was better, a symbol of what could happen when people chose connection over division. And in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for his community, hope for the future, and hope that no matter how hard the fight, love and understanding would always find a way to win.